Hello, everyone. Reality Stop here, and I'm super excited to unveil the 2.4 release of the community add-on pack for Bolt. It's been a while since we had an update, but we've got some really cool toys to show you this time that hopefully are worth the wait. And I have to just come right out front and say that the major new addition, these defined events that we're going to get into here in just a moment, I'm going to show you how to use those, what they do, and give you a good grip on how you would go about implementing those yourself. I am not the original author of those units. The original author is a Discord user by the name of A Fool's Duty. He made these units back probably July timeframe, and I asked for permission to include them. You get a little snapshot here. I asked for permission to include them in the add-on pack, and he said, yeah, absolutely, go ahead. And at the time, we were still working on 1.4 compatibility and the Variadic units. And then right after that, we got our first glimpse at the Bolt 2 timeline. So I almost felt like introducing this might be like a waste of effort, and I didn't necessarily know if this would be compatible with Bolt 2. But after mentioning this on the Discord a while back, a couple of weeks ago, I kind of got a fair amount of pushback from people saying, you know, you shouldn't wait on others, you should just go ahead and do this. And well, I mean, the units have actually been out there since July. Now, we have taken those units and we have beefed them up a lot. We've improved the performance, we've enabled live editing, we've added in the ability to have the default values in the ports, we've added in the type filters on those drop downs you can see there, and we're going to show all of that off and what these events do here in a little bit. But understand that everything that I'm kind of going over here, you should be able to find on the release page. We go into how you can implement this, how you can access the API, what the performance characteristics are. We're going to talk about that. Don't worry, it's not doom and despair. And the other few things that we've added in, which you'll see during the course of this. So here I have world's most simple project ever imaginable. My scene consists of a sphere and a cube. It's really super simple, but it's just going to be just a simple example that I can throw together really quick to show how we might do something like this. So what this is we have two flow graphs. We have the cube and we have the sphere. And the sphere has a simple mouse follow script on it that just gets the mouse position, follows it around in the world. And we implement a custom event that takes some damage. And whenever we take damage, we log the damage, we subtract the health, and then we destroy the object that did damage to us. Presumably this might be a bullet, or it might be some destructible element in your game that gets destroyed whenever it gets touched. Now, in my case, I'm not destroying it because at runtime or during development, I may want to just re-enable this so I can keep re-triggering it without exiting play mode each time. So I'm just disabling the object. In a real project, it'd probably be a destroy. But this is just a simple example, and then over on our cube we actually have our collision detection. Now I know collision detection works on both entities, but for the purposes of demonstration, our cube here is doing the collision detection, and then it's sending the event over to the sphere to actually act on. And it's adding in some additional information such as the damage, and later on we'll have a little element for whether the damage should be considered a critical hit or something like that. Maybe it ignores armor or something like that. So I could just easily show this off. If I go into play mode here, the sphere will follow my cursor around, and don't worry, we're going to mention that thing that popped up in the console here in a moment. We've gotten some questions about that on the Discord. But if I go over here and I touch it, boom, we say we took 1 damage from the cube, and it gets set inactive. So it worked. Real quick, these messages have started popping up in Bolt 1.41, and there was some question whether they were from the community units. As far as I could tell, no. If you actually look in here, it says what it's having fits about, and it's like the Unity engine purchasing payout, lists of purchasing, initialization, failure reason. It's all purchasing stuff. It's not related to the community project, but I also don't know how to get rid of it. So if you see this, just do a quick skim, make sure there aren't any community units appearing in this message here, but for now we just have to deal with it. If you find something that is from the community, then let me know, I'll fix it. Okay, so what the defined events are trying to solve is this custom event system is very, it's like you got to memorize it, right? You've got a string here for the event name that you could forget. If you come back to the project after 6 months, you don't remember what your event names were. I mean, you hope that they're self-explanatory. I know this is take damage. Okay, well, it's a message telling me to take damage, but if I was sitting down and I wanted to work on something, I might not necessarily know what events I even had, let alone where I was using them. And then also we have a list of arguments that can become desynchronized. So maybe in one place I added an event, a parameter, but on the other side I have to manually go in here and say, oh, I have a special argument that's new. And even then, I can't tell what these arguments are. I can't tell if I've changed the order, or if I come and later on to try to use this, what is that? What is argument 0? Well, I could tell you just by looking at this graph. I can start to look at it and say, okay, well, this is arg 0, which is the amount of damage, and the argument 1 is the damage source if it's not null. Okay, yeah, I can figure it out, but there's nothing in there that clues us into what our arguments are, what order they're in, what type they are. Is this a game object? Is this a component? Is this some sort of script that's some damager script or something like that? What is it? And we don't know. And it's really easy for these systems to become out of sync. If you're working with lots of scenes and things like that, you might, if you're trying to do composited scenes, it's very easy for you to change it in one place and you haven't changed it in the other scene, and now things break. So, like for instance here, in one place I have it with 2 arguments, and in another I have it with 3. Now, I'm not using the third argument, but the point is, it's easy to get out of sync. So that's what defined events are trying to solve. They aren't trying to necessarily change the way you work with events. They're just trying to fix these deficiencies as your project grows. They're trying to make it more intuitive and clearer. You still have to wire. It still doesn't help with the whole finding where the events are used, but it's hopefully making everything clearer and providing less opportunity for mistakes. So, how we actually go about creating defined events is we actually have to dip into C#. And for this, I do apologize a little bit. Bolt 2 is planning on having a system where you don't have to, but we don't have access to all those UI frameworks and stuff like that. It would be very complex. So right now, we're going to be defining in code what an event is. Now, it's not complex. If you've actually looked at the GitHub page, you'll see that, and we're going to create one here on camera. It's not all that complex, and there's not a lot that you actually have to know to be able to do it. So I'm actually going to go into my project, and I have already, of course, included all my plugins, and I've included the separate defined events package that you can get from the GitHub. It's separate from the fundamentals because we're not 100% sure that it works on all platforms, specifically that being the AOT platforms. I do not have an AOT device in my house to even be able to test, and I apologize for that. Hopefully we'll find out very quickly, and we'll update the GitHub page, and I'll try to update the forum post as well. And hopefully leave a comment on this video once we do know for sure that it's safe for those platforms, but at this time I simply don't know, so I'm packaging it separately, and you can get it from the GitHub page there alongside of the fundamentals, which of course does work on AOT platforms. So we're going to go in here and we're just going to create a new script, and it's just going to be a floating script out here. I could create a folder here if I wanted to. Why don't we do that? And we'll have our event definitions. And inside there, I'm going to create a new C# script. And this is going to be for my take damage event. Once Visual Studio opens up to your script, what we're going to do is we're going to basically get rid of everything that Visual Studio added, just so we have kind of an empty class. Now, it can be a struct as well. If you're familiar with C#, you understand what the differences between structs and classes are. It will work with either one. There's no reason why it won't. For me, I'm going to be doing a struct. A struct is a value type, whereas a class is a reference type. So your value types are things like integer, float, doubles, bools, and structs. And then for classes are your reference types, which are things like your your object, things that have toString and equals, and you can pass them around by reference. So in this case, I'm just going to do a struct because I'm just going to have simple stuff in it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a colon to denote that I'm implementing something, or I derive from something. In this case, it's implementing a particular interface that is in the defined events assembly. And I'm just going to type it, and then I'm going to show you how you can just quickly bring this up. It's I defined event. Now, if I hit Control Space, you'll see it knows what namespace this is in. It's in Bolt.Addons.Community. If you're working in some other IDE, just make sure that you add this using to your code. And in fact, I can just go get rid of this. Just make sure you add that using, and then you have access to this interface. This interface does not add anything to, any requirements to your implementer. It's just there for tagging purposes, so that later on, Bolt's going to be able to look for this this tag and know everything that implements it, so it can display a list of our events to us. So let's go ahead and add in. We're going to add a public int for damage. Could be a float, but we're going to make a public int for damage. We're going to have a public game object damage source. Okay, and then the last thing that we need to do is we need to tell Bolt that we care about this class or this struct to go ahead and include it in the fuzzy finder. This actually isn't quite enough. Unfortunately, we do have to actually add an attribute to our class that is include in settings true. If I didn't add this, what I would have to do is I would have to go through the unit option wizard and add the class manually so that Bolt knows about it, it includes it in the fuzzy finder. You're going to find this attribute, though, which allows us to kind of short-circuit that in the Ludic namespace. And what this does is it says, even though it's not in the unit option wizards, I'm manually tagging this entity, this class, this struct, it's something that I should include inside of the fuzzy finder. And from there on, it will continue to keep that up to date. Now, you can use this on your own code. You can't really use it on the third-party code that you want to also include in Bolt, because if you were to add this attribute to classes inside of your third-party code that you've downloaded from the asset store, if you then ever get an update to that code, it's just going to blow away the change that you made, and you're going to lose those units. So in those cases, you still have to go through the unit option wizard. For us, since this is something that we wrote, we can just add this attribute, and we're done. This is everything that we had to do to make that same take damage event that we showed off in the Bolt graph just a few moments ago. So we're going to go ahead and save this. We're going to flip back to Unity, and once Unity refreshes here and gets its brain straightened out, we're going to go to the Tools, Bolt, Build Unit Options. And what this does is this is that process wherein Bolt goes through and it looks through all your code and everything to look for things that it should include in the options. If you're using the unit option wizard, you don't have to do this, but anytime you're adding things using those other methods, either through DLLs or the include in settings, or you're adding in things like the community add-ons that have custom units that just automatically include themselves, you have to go through this menu and say build unit options. And in fact, when you bring in these DLLs, you'll have to do that so that they even become available. But once that's done, Bolt is aware of everything that is tagged, and it's going to be in the fuzzy finder for us. So I'm here on my cube, and I want to replace this trigger. And I want to replace the trigger with if I can spell it right, trigger defined event. And this unit is an analog of the custom event trigger. But what it's going to do is it's going to offer us the ability to select from all of our events that we have defined, and it will take care of building the ports for us. Now, when we click on this, you'll notice that it's a heavily restricted list. That's because Bolt knows about that I-defined event interface that we added to our struct, and it's filtering down to just things that implement that. So it knows every event that we have defined in our entire project and is exposing that here. Now, I didn't actually include a namespace on this, You'll see I don't have any sort of namespace around that. But if I did, then I would essentially have filters or folders inside of the fuzzy finder. So I can even group my events into types of events, UI events or networking events or whatever categorization you want to give them. You can create folders inside of the fuzzy finder. But we didn't do that, so they're just sitting here in the global namespace, and I could pick take damage. And the unit automatically builds ports for everything that we defined. And since we're using simple types like the boolean, or sorry, the integer, the damage source here is a game object, it understands that it can offer pickers for those. And so we could just say, oh, well, you know, the damage should be 5. Now, in this case, we're not going to do that. We're going to wire it up to our variable, but we could. So we're just going to wire this up the same way we have this one up here. We're going to say the event target is the other collider, and rewire the control flow. And there we go. It's really kind of wired the exact same, but we know what everything is, we know what type everything is, we know what our events are, everything is there for us to use. So now we need to go make the corresponding change on our sphere. So instead of this custom event, I'm going to have a defined event. And I'm going to give it the type of take damage. And we have output ports that we can use. I know that wires to that. I need to log the damage. And I need to wire that to my plus equals. Oops, that was a mistake that I didn't catch before. And I need my damage source to be checked for null and damage source to the set active. And actually to the get name here as well. Okay, so now we've wired this up. If we did everything right, it should just work. So let's give it a test. Wait for Unity to go into play mode here. Here's my sphere. Boom. Let's make sure the console. Sure enough, it worked. And I can prove that here if I set these side by side. I can prove that it's triggering. Let's do that real quick. Come on, Unity. There we go. Big enough I can see the cube, please. So you're just going to have to take my word that the rest of the graph executes here, but boom, it executes. Everything works as it should. And what's really cool about this is it's updatable. So you know before I said, well, what happens if I add this extra parameter that's this is critical? Well, let's do that. Let's pop over to Visual Studio, and we're going to go in here and we're going to say, we also have a public bool is critical. Now, I'm going to be helped out in this case because bool is something that is defaultable. It's something that we know the values for. And so I don't have to necessarily provide that port. It's going to automatically get a value of false. But let's go ahead and add this. We're going to come back over to Bolt. And what do you know? We now have is critical available to us. Typed, available, there, it's ordered. Everything's already there. And in fact, I could go over to Cube and say, oh, it is critical. And there we go. All my events have updated. Now, if it's something that I do have to provide a value for, I'm still going to get the runtime exceptions where it says, hey, this port isn't fulfilled. But it's going to take you right to the source. If that error happens, I can just double click on the error and it takes me right to the trigger that that happened at, because essentially it's happening on the trigger side. Instead of it happening on the exit side of the event, where, oh, I have never fulfilled this port or something like that on my trigger, instead it's going to happen right here and say, well, hey, you never satisfied this port here. So that helps us debug, and not only that, but it's really obvious, hey, there was another argument here. It wasn't something that I had to go in and manually say, oh, increment the argument count from 2 to 3 everywhere that this happens. It automatically increments, and it's up to me to make sure that that's fulfilled properly, but it's maintained for me. And also, yeah, I mean, we have the type information, so there's no guessing. I know exactly which one is my damage source. I don't have to try to align and say, oh, well, is it the second argument or is it the third that's my damage source? I don't have to know. It's labeled for me, and it's typed. It's easy. So we're looking at probably going to be expanding this later on to say that certain ports are optional or using attributes to make it a little bit more sophisticated. We don't know. This is where you, the community, can step in and kind of help us out where we should take this in the future, what other improvements we should add to it. But that's how it works. If we wanted to add a different event, we certainly could. Let's go ahead and do that. I'll just reuse the same file here. And let's say we have an event for game over. So we have something like public struct game over, if I can type, I define event, and we're going to have, normally we might have some sort of player that's the winner, but in this case we're just going to have a public game object that's the winner. And then maybe also we have a the game time, how long the game took. Okay, and then we're going to also tell Bolt to include this one as well. Okay, we'll flip back over to Unity. We'll go back in, we'll tell Bolt to build our unit options again. Again, this is only required when adding types, and I think at first you're going to be adding a lot of events when you start to use a system like this, but then over time you're only doing this every so often. You're not doing it fairly frequently. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. It's something that you don't have to do with a custom event system, but for me, I feel like this system is worth this minor inconvenience here. So we'll give this a moment to finish, and then we can easily swap out the event type. Now, we have added support for live editing of these, so I could even on the fly change the event type, rewire it, and it'll work. It'll work inside the editor. But yeah, now I should be able to go in here, and sure enough, my game over event is there, and of course it doesn't have the same ports. It has winner and game time, but I could break these port connections and do whatever logic I needed to do from this. So let's set that back to the way it was. One of the things that we mentioned, and I kind of want to go over with you, is the real quick is how you would do this from code. You can see here we have a couple different options for how you might want to do something like this, like pre-constructing it so that you're not creating new memory each time you call it, or you could just kind of have on-the-fly construction. We also have the global version of this. So instead of saying what the target object is, like you do with the custom events and the normal defined event, there is such a thing as a global defined event. And you'll notice here it does not take a source, neither does the trigger. That's because this is actually triggering across your entire active project. If I was to call one of these, and of course it works with the same types, if I was to call one of these, I don't have to specify where I'm sending it. But of course, there's trade-offs with that. For one, you might have a lot of logic that has to ignore some of the events. But there's also a performance trade-off, and that's where I go into, in this in-editor performance, that when you're running in the Unity editor, we do not perform all of the optimizations that we do in built code. And the reason for that is supporting the live editing that Bolt does. So in Bolt, when you're working with events, you register to the event bus. Don't worry about that technical term, but you register the event and say, hey, I want to listen into this thing. And that thing is identified by three pieces of information. One is if there's an object that you want to listen to. Another is the event name that you want to listen to. So like defined event or custom event or update. And then the last piece of information is like a tag that just says, yeah, I know, but I don't want all of them. I just want this subset of that event. And unfortunately, that registration only happens once. And so what we'd like to do is say, well, my object is this object, or in the case of the global, there isn't one. My name is defined event, and then my tag is take damage. But then I can't use the live editing, because if I try to change the event to something else, that I can't update that tag that's registered in Bolt. And so it wouldn't work. Live editing would break. Now, the benefit of giving all of that information is it's kind of like pre-optimization. You pay the cost once of having this extra information in Bolt, but the payoff is Bolt only calls into you if you're going to care about the event. With global events, when we're working in the editor, we can't do that and support live editing. So what that means is we're going to listen for every global defined event firing on any graph on every object, every global defined event. It's going to be a lot of extra, if you have a lot of these, it's going to be a lot of extra checks just to make sure that the event type matches and we should fire. So in other words, we're not able to do the pre-optimization. Instead, like every time it fires, we have to do that check. Now, that doesn't affect built code, because in built code, we know you're not going to be changing it dynamically. We know you're not going to be changing the event type because it's not even a port. You can't. And so we go ahead and we do the extra optimizations. Now, if you're working with a large project and you want to use these global defined events, again, it doesn't really affect the regular defined events as much because you are filtering by object. So it's only looking at the events on that object and saying, oh, is the event type matching? But in a large project with lots of game objects, heavy use of the globals would be a bit of a performance drag in the editor because, again, we can't do all these optimizations unless you specify this. This is something if you're going into that and you want to turn off the live editing capability and instead you want to have the optimized version in the editor, add this snippet of code into your project and you'll get it. This allows you to override the behavior of the defined event class so that even in Bolt, or even in the editor, it's going to give you the optimized version. Lastly, we have a little bit of extra new stuff. We have a new, you actually saw it there, we have a new log node. Instead of having a port and forcing you to use string literals, you can just type in your value or automatically call toString. If you leave this blank, it'll just automatically toString the first argument if it's a one argument log. Or you can give a format string and use multiple arguments, and this is full string formatting, so you can use the length specifiers and padding and all that regular C# gives you. So this is a format string, and then you can specify up to, I think, 10 arguments. And here you can see we're using 2. We're saying damage 1 from the game object name. So we don't have to go and because otherwise you need a string literal and then call into string format and then pass the arguments. And it's a lot of extra stuff. And I'd rather do this and provide it all in one node because I use the logging a lot, particularly when I'm developing these nodes. So that's kind of the core of what's in Bolt, the Bolt Community Add-ons Pack 2.4. Let us know what you think. Give us some feedback, and we'll see where we go from here. Again, this is in a separate package from the fundamentals package because we're not 100% sure that it works on AOT platforms. I can't test that. I don't have an AOT platform available to me. In fact, I don't even have mono-based stacks available to me. I only have PC here to be able to test on at the current time. So I'll update the forum post and the GitHub as we find out the exact platforms these work on, so that there's no question on your end whether it's going to work for your project or not. Again, just fire messages to me on Discord. I'll be happy to answer any questions and help you define your events. Just give me any feedback that you have, and thank you again to A Fool's Duty for the idea and the pioneering of these units. He did the initial groundwork and building these ports. We've taken it and we've tried to run as much as we can with it to an end that we think is beneficial to the community. We have a few ideas of ways to take it further, but we need to do more research on platform capabilities before we do that. But again, a huge thanks to him for giving us permission to use these. Hope to see you next time, and go make something awesome.